Well, hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Nina Ha, and I'm the director of the Asian Cultural Engagement Center, or the ACE Center. I want to welcome all of you to our final week of Asian Pacific Islander Desi American Heritage Month, or APIDAHM. Before this event, I would like to start with the Virginia Tech's Land and Labor Acknowledgement. So goes, Virginia Tech acknowledges that we live and work on the Tutelo and Monacan people's homeland, and we recognize their continued relationships with their lands and waterways. We further acknowledge that legislation and practices like the Morrill Act of 1862 enabled the Commonwealth of Virginia to finance and found Virginia Tech through the forced removal of Native nations from their lands, both locally and in Western territories. We understand that honoring Native peoples without explicit material commitments falls short of our institutional responsibilities. Through sustained, transparent, and meaningful engagement with the Tutelo and Monacan peoples and other Native nations, we commit to changing the trajectory of Virginia Tech's history by increasing Indigenous students, staff, and faculty recruitment and retention, diversifying course offerings, and meeting the growing needs of all Virginia tribes and supporting their sovereignty. We must also recognize that enslaved Black people generated revenue and resources used to establish Virginia Tech and were prohibited from attending until 1953. Through inclusive VT, the institutional and individual commitment to PROSUM that I may serve in the spirit of community, diversity, and excellence, we commit to advancing a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive community. Whew. Okay. First, I would like to ask Dr. Yulia Hoban, who is co-sponsoring this event, to say a few words about Mosaico, the living learning community at Virginia Tech.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Ha, for this introduction and welcoming us to this space. My name is Yulia Hoban. I am Program Director for Mosaico Living Learning Community, and I also serve as Assistant Director at Cranwell International Center. In Mosaico, our mission is to foster spaces for intercultural learning and cultural immersion. We also a living learning community, meaning that we create spaces for international students and domestic students to live together and learn together, and spaces for language immersion. We have what we call language houses, 9 language houses for students to learn different languages, from Arabic and Mandarin to French, German, and Italian. And I see some of my students here as well. And the topic of today's conversation, which is on displacement, meaning of what it is to be a refugee and perspectives of refugees, is very close to conversations that we have in our community. So I want to welcome our speakers and looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I'd like to present the panel, Reimagining Vietnamese Refugees. I would also like to thank my colleagues, Drs. Amanda Demmer, Jana Lippman, and Tim August, for agreeing to participate on this panel. Given what is going on in the US and around the world, we thought it would be beneficial to address the issue of refugees by highlighting the Vietnamese refugee positionality so that we can gain a perspective on our current landscape. Given that, quote, unquote, the fall of Saigon occurred in April of 1975, it seemed appropriate to commemorate what happened then with what is taking place now in April of 2022. As with any programming, I couldn't have done this without the work of and support of my ACE programming assistants, my colleagues in the cultural and community centers, as well as the Office for Inclusion and Diversity, not to mention all of my campus partners and academic departments. Without further ado, I would like to present the order of the speakers, which is Dr. Amanda Demmer, followed by Dr. Jana Lippman, and then Dr. Timothy August. We will reserve questions, answers, and comments for after all of the presentations. So Dr. Demmer, would you like to begin?
Hi, everyone. My name is Amanda Demmer, and I am a professor here at Virginia Tech. I teach and research about war and diplomacy and migration. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak with you all today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. and to offer some insight on our topic today of reimagining Vietnamese refugees. I'm going to be drawing from my book, which came out a year ago this month. Hooray, called After Saigon's Fall, Refugees and US Vietnamese Relations, 1975 to 2000. And as you can tell, no doubt from the title, this book traces the importance of refugees and migration issues and US Vietnamese relations after the war. And more specifically, what I do in the book is I trace the time between these two photos, these two relatively well-known historical moments. As Nina mentioned, right, the so-called fall of Saigon in April of 1975, and then President Clinton's announcement that the United States and Vietnam had normalized relations in the mid-1990s. This announcement is in July of 1995. And in these intervening 20 years, there were no formal economic or diplomatic relations between the governments in Washington and Saigon, or excuse me, wow, there's a slip, Washington and Hanoi. And for quite a while, I think the general depiction was one of frozen relations for those 20 years. And what I argue in the book is that normalization was a process, not a moment. And despite the appearance of a 20-year impasse, that the normalization process was highly contingent, highly controversial, and something that occurred slowly over 20 years rather than miraculously or instantaneously in July of 1995. I also argue that this process of normalization, that is sort of the thawing of relations or going from war to peace between the United States and Vietnam, that this didn't merely occur at the same time that 1 million Vietnamese refugees were settled in the United States, that those two processes were linked. They were mutually constitutive, and that negotiating and implementing migration programs became one of the primary means through which the former foes normalized relations over the 20-year period. And just sort of a brief look at what I'm sure we're all going to be talking about in different ways today. Various groups of Vietnamese resettlement in the United States. 130,000 evacuated alongside US personnel in April of 1975. And then tens of thousands more came in the late 1970s through a series of additional paroles. There are over 425,000 of the so-called boat people who left Vietnam, arrived in camps throughout Southeast Asia, and then eventually resettled in the United States. Jana will be telling us, no doubt, more about those who left Vietnam and were elsewhere in the diaspora. And then finally, a group, another over 500,000 who traveled directly from Vietnam to the United States through a program called the Orderly Departure Program, which was meant to obviate the dangers of clandestine flight and protracted stays in camps, and provide a means for would-be boat people to leave Vietnam safely. And this program was a multilateral program. The United States was one of many resettlement nations, but the overwhelming majority did go to the United States. And underneath this umbrella multilateral program, the United States and Vietnam negotiated separate bilateral programs specifically for Amerasians, the children of US servicemen and Vietnamese women, and those who were incarcerated in re-education camps. And so for my talk today, I really want to focus on this last group, those who traveled through the Orderly Departure Program, and especially those former re-education camp prisoners who traveled through the HO program, which was negotiated in 1989. And so for our topic today of reimagining Vietnamese refugees, I want to offer kind of two correctives or two contributions, which my work is a part of a much larger trend for both of these. And the first is to suggest that we can see South Vietnam after 1975 in Long Thi Boi's really elegant phrase as a ghost nation, as no longer a state, but as a nation that continued on, that was carried forward by the diaspora and by the refugees from the war. And my contribution to that scholarship is to really show how South Vietnam persisted not only culturally as a ghost nation, but as an important player in international relations. I argue the only way that we can sort of make sense of the normalization process is to understand, like the war years, that this isn't just a bilateral issue of the governments in Washington and Hanoi, but that we need to include the South Vietnamese in the picture. Secondly, my work and the work of my co-panelists as well shows that Vietnamese refugees, not just as recipients of policy, that is not just as groups that are acted upon, but as groups that themselves are important and active contributors to larger processes. And for today, I'm going to focus on one specific group, the Families of Vietnamese Political Prisoners Association. And so I want to kick off by telling you a little bit about that group, the Families of Vietnamese Political Prisoners Association. I'm going to call it the association just for ease of usage. The association's founder, Cuc Minh Tho. Tho was born in 1939, excuse me, in the Mekong Delta. She was the third youngest of 7 children. And as a teenager, she went to receive private education in Saigon, which tells you a little bit about her family's relative resources and standing. She married in 1958. Her husband was a graduate of the South Vietnamese Military Academy, so as an officer in the ARVN. And in 1961, she received the tragic news that her husband had been killed in combat. When she received that news, she was pregnant with their 3rd child. So in 1961, as the US is escalating the war, right, Kennedy is president, Cuc Minh Tho is a young widow who's trying to navigate that increasing escalation of the war. And when Saigon, before I get to that, I should add, she eventually marries again to another member of the South Vietnamese military. And when Saigon falls, she was working at the South Vietnamese embassy in the Philippines. So she was in Manila watching as events unfolded in Vietnam, and for 3 months did not know the fate of her 3 children or her second husband. Sort of miraculously in the context of the time, she gets a letter informing her that they are all alive, which is a huge relief. But she also learns that her second husband is incarcerated in a re-education camp. So this audience, less than others, I don't have to explain as much, but I'll just pause to say that in the wake of its victory, the government in Hanoi implements a re-education policy that requires all former civilian and military leaders of the defeated South Vietnam to report for re-education. And initially, this is advertised as a 10 to 30 day period of re-education, reacclimation, and the implication was reintegration into society. What actually happens is that those incarcerated in the camps are detained for years. They receive barely subsistence rations, very little medical care, forced confessions, they're moved around, things of this nature. The last detainees are not released until 1992. So Cuc Minh Tho arrives in the United States in 1977. And the association starts meeting informally in her living room. This is initially a collection of women whose husbands, brothers, sons, sweethearts, friends are incarcerated in these camps in Vietnam. and really starts as what association members call in retrospect a support group. Later, it becomes what I argue one of the most powerful Vietnamese American lobbying groups in the country. So in 1984, the United States announces its intention to create a sub-program through the Orderly Departure Program for re-education camp prisoners. But it's not until 1989 that the humanitarian operation is negotiated. And then you can see here other important milestones. The first detainees come the next year, last detainees released in 1992. 1996 McCain Amendment is something I will talk about at the end if there's time. If not, please feel free to ask me in the Q&A. But in this timeline, I'm going to focus here in between the second and third bullet points. How do we get from sort of the intention, okay, we're going to create a program, to it actually coming into practice? And what I argue in my book is that the association and its members were absolutely instrumental in creating and helping this go from a vision, a hope, to actual bilateral policy. So the association as an important force in policymaking, I'll point to three separate ways that they acted in important ways. And the first is that they played a vital role in what scholars call the politics of information, because they had access to what the LA Times really smartly called the Vietnamese grapevine. So all of these, the association was centered in Virginia, near DC, and Falls Church, but they had ties throughout the diaspora. And once the association becomes officially incorporated in 1984, members throughout the Vietnamese diaspora who have loved ones incarcerated in camps, they start contacting Cook Minh Tho and her associates, and they're sending information about their loved ones, where they're being held, what their rank was in the ARVN, all of this information that the association, with their language skills, with their transnational networks, they assemble and compile this information, which is US officials regularly admit is better than what they can get. And so this information is important, not just because of the abstract information is power, but in a very literal sense here, because to emigrate through the Orderly Departure Program, your name has to appear on two lists: a list approved by the United States, or a resettlement nation on one hand, and by Vietnam on the other hand. And so the government in Hanoi refuses to publish the names of re-education camp detainees. And this should have left the United States in a tough bind, because without being able to advocate on the behalf of individuals, how is it going to secure emigration through this program? And so the Families of Vietnamese Political Prisoners Association steps into this information vacuum by providing US officials with constantly updated lists of very accurate and valuable information. This information is all the more powerful because of sort of their second key strength. People were listening. The association, Cook Minh Tho and her associates, were very, very good at building and maintaining personal relationships with US officials, members of Congress, and State Department officials especially. So here we can see a young Cook Minh Tho with Senators Bob Dole and Ted Kennedy, of course, political heavyweights of their respective parties, presidential contenders, and using a language of family reunification, of humanitarianism. The association is able to pitch its cause in a way that US policymakers respond to readily. So this photo is taken from the association's first annual reception and dinner held on Capitol Hill in 1987. And Kennedy and Dole both gave speeches in support of the association, and the next day backed their words with action, co-sponsoring a joint resolution calling on the government in Hanoi to release all re-education camp detainees and allow them to emigrate. I should note that Dole argued this resolution was, quote, non-political, and argued it should be nonpartisan, and in a move almost unheard of for anything related to Vietnam, it was. The resolution and the avalanche of others like it passed unanimously. And so the association had close ties with US officials. Here's Cook Minh To with President Reagan on Human Rights Day that same year. And when I argue in the book, perhaps one of the most important relationships is with Robert Funzeth, who was the Senior Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. And so what that means is that he's high ranking enough to be important. He's the lead negotiator with Vietnam on the re-education camp issues, but he's not so high ranking as to be someone who's changed with each presidential appointment. He's someone, sort of service appointee rather than a political appointee in the State Department. And Cook Minh To and her associates, they meet with Funzeth on the weekends to go over specific cases. They develop a close relationship. When Funzeth signs the HO agreement, he calls his wife Marilyn from the airport to inform her of the good news. Marilyn immediately, the first person Marilyn calls is To. And Funzeth gives Cook Minh To the pen he used to sign the agreement to symbolize the importance and the momentum the association had in creating this agreement. I should note that the information also ran the other way. So while the association provided information to US government officials, vitally important information, they also provided information to their fellow members of the diaspora. And special newsletters like this, which were printed in Vietnamese and in English, sent to all corners of the diaspora throughout the globe. And this informed people about changes in procedural things like the immigration policy, what forms you needed, where to send the forms, printed letters of support from US officials, included poetry and songs from members of the diaspora. So these newsletters were really a way to keep fellow refugees informed, and also to kind of create and sustain community and hope as this lobbying is happening. So there's so much more I can and do say in the book about this group and the cause for which they were a part. But to keep to my time today, for our purposes, I just want to note that this HO program was one of many. You can see the dates here on the slide. US officials are continually negotiating and implementing new migration programs, not only throughout the late 1970s, which I think is sort of generally well known, but throughout the 80s and even into the early and mid 1990s, right? So this last program, there's actually two in 1996. This is after Clinton's announcement that relations have been normalized. US officials are still creating new programs for Vietnamese refugees. And this quote here, the second quote, I think captures, right, this is a US official noting that the US government has more contact with the Vietnamese government on operational and policy levels than any other Western nation, including those which maintain diplomatic relations. So I think this helps capture, right, US officials are saying this is not normalizing relations, but we shouldn't really take them at their word. That the contact, cooperation, compromise that's involved in these programs really helps lay the foundation in many ways of post-war relations between the former foes, that migration programs, along with the full accounting effort for missing American servicemen, that these combine together to create an ongoing basis of contact despite the appearance of a 20-year impasse. So just to end briefly on our thinking about reimagining refugees, I think that my book and no doubt the work of my co-panelists that you'll hear about in just a moment, I think we offer some ways of both helping us understand the numbers that are at play, but also bringing forth the individuals, the contingency, the way, the advocacy of those on the ground in the United States and Southeast Asia, that they mattered. It's for my purposes, as well as thinking about these programs in the context of bilateral relations, it's sort of easy, I think, in a narrative about the Cold War emigration of refugees fleeing communism to think, well, of course, the United States was going to admit Vietnamese refugees. And my work suggests it's not nearly that simple, that those programs were the work of hard-fought policymaking, in some cases over decades, and that members of the Vietnamese diaspora were key players in that larger process. Thanks for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. Jan?
Great. Well, thank you so much. And thanks to Amanda for her great talk. And we really do have a lot of themes in common, particularly the importance of recognizing that not all Vietnamese were always seen as refugees, and it was not a guarantee that Vietnamese would automatically be relocated to the US, and the fact that Vietnamese American and diasporic activism was key. Really briefly about myself, my name is Jana Littman. I teach US history at Tulane University in New Orleans. But right now I'm in Vienna, Austria on a Fulbright. And so my vision has been looking far more towards Eastern Europe than I ever would have imagined. I'm going to share my screen now so we can see my PowerPoint. But I might come back because I actually prefer not being on. That's the wrong thing. Boom, boom, boom. Here we go. And I will go here. 1 second. So you would think tears into the pandemic, I would be better at this. Here we go. From the beginning. Excellent. Okay, so that's who I am. And I just wanted to, I think when we began organizing this roundtable, at least I was thinking far more about Afghanistan and what the withdrawal of the US from Afghanistan and how that paralleled with Vietnam or not. But now, of course, I'm in Vienna. And so all of the conversations that I'm part of are looking at Ukrainians in Poland and Romania, coming to Austria and to Germany. And those are really the questions that have been animating my colleagues here in Central Europe. And so I've really had to rethink, what does my research have to say about our current political moment? How does the research that I've done, or Professor Demmer have done on refugees, allow us to think not only about Vietnam, but also about other parts of the world? And I hope that this talk will both allow us to think specifically about the 1970s and 80s in Southeast Asia, but raise larger questions as well. So here we can see some recent headlines from the news about Ukrainians leaving the country. Here we see, oh goodness, of course my PowerPoint is sticky. Here we go. Again, 5 million Ukrainian refugees have gone, more than 5 million. And what is the US doing? Yes.
Just to let you know that you're showing us a Word document and not.
Oh, still?
Yeah, not your PowerPoint.
No. Oh goodness, thank you for letting me know. I had it as a PowerPoint. Let me try one more time, and if it doesn't work, I'll just talk. Let me see. Here we go. Is that better? Yes, thank you.
Yes.
All right. So here are images of Ukrainians, and let's see if here we go. And here's my book. So the big questions would be, who is a refugee and who determines the status? And how do these experiences resonate at the highest political levels and in the local communities, often in places we would imagine as peripheral? And I have a few suggestions for us today. One is to pay attention to legal status. Professor Demmer had up sort of in parentheses parole. There are a lot of statuses that are used for people who the media and for advocates, and in fact, most people refer to as refugees. But in fact, most of these individuals do not have quote unquote refugee status. So Vietnamese often have parole status, asylum seekers. Later, there are people with refugee status. Today, we see something right now for Ukrainians, temporary protective status. What is TPS? Why do people get TPS rather than refugee status? Or if we look at Afghanis, they're given special immigrant visas, SIV. What is a special immigrant visa and why do people get that rather than getting asylum or refugee? My key point, these categories are meant to either include or exclude, and they're all politically constructed in specific political moments. So that's the first thing for us to pay attention to. Secondly, to recognize host countries and places where people go before they're, quote, resettled. In my research, I look at Malaysia, I look at Guam, the Philippines, and Hong Kong. a few years ago, and even today, if we're looking at the Syrian crisis, I think it's really important that we understand the politics of Turkey or Jordan as before we just think of Germany. At the moment, what are the politics of Poland, of Romania, of Moldova? Places which have been very hostile to migrants in the last decade are all of a sudden taking in millions of people. What are those local politics? Why do we see such a change? Or if the US context, what are the politics of Mexico? How do we have to understand US-Mexican relations to understand what's going on along the border? Finally, thinking of individuals as political actors. And this is something where my work really resonates, I believe, with my colleagues and co-panelists today, which is that we all really understand Vietnamese refugees not as people who are abject or pathetic. I really try to avoid the word plight in all of my writing, but rather seeing political activism, political networks. This can range from protest to fundraising to advocacy to lobbying to writing and everything in between. So those are my key framing devices. So here we can say who is a refugee. And so again, in some ways recapping this. And one of the key things that I want to sort of reiterate that Professor Demmer sort of noted is that this is the image which I think most of us have in our head. It's the images on Professor Demmer's book of 1975 of Vietnamese leaving Saigon. But as those of us who have studied this know, in fact, the largest number of people do not leave in 1975. In fact, far more people leave after 1975. The 130,000 people leave in 1975 are only the very first group. And as Professor Demmer noted, they come in as parolees. After that, I'm going to come to this slide. In 1979, the vast majority of Vietnamese are granted first asylum and resettlement. There's a conference in 1979, which is really a response to the large quote unquote boat people crisis, where large numbers of largely South Vietnamese are leaving Southern Vietnam, and they're seen as a quote crisis, and this will lead to granting Vietnamese refugee status. And this will persist until 1988 and comes to what I want to talk about today, is how did Vietnamese go from being seen as refugees to having to make individual asylum claims? This is really important because I think in the United States, there's generally an assumption that Vietnamese were all refugees. They were anti-communist, they were supporting the US, or the US was supporting them, to be more specific, in South Vietnam. And that as a result, the United States gives them preferential resettlement because of these ideological ties. And this story in many ways is largely true. It is more true for Vietnamese than it is for many other nationality groups. Vietnamese definitely have a privileged status, say, over other nationalities, El Salvadorans, Nicaraguans, Haitians, or either other Southeast Asians. However, they were not all automatically refugees, and they're definitely not all settled in the United States. And this will become more tenuous as we move through the 1980s. So on the one hand, think of Professor Demmer's discussion, which is about this ongoing diplomatic negotiation, which will lead to more migration. At the same time, the international sort of refugee regime and the United States are also becoming more restrictive of how many Vietnamese they're going to admit and who is allowed to enter as a Vietnamese refugee and who is not. And so you have both of these happening at the same time. So I want to focus my discussion on Hong Kong very specifically. So Hong Kong, if we look at this map, is right here. And because of where it is geographically, they get more people from northern Vietnam. Also recognize that Hong Kong is a British colony up until 1997. So these will play an important role of how Hong Kong sees the incoming Vietnamese. Initially, between 1979 and 1982, really from 1975 to 1982, Hong Kong has what are called open camps. This means that people are not incarcerated, they can come and go. Many of them actually work in Hong Kong. Many of the Vietnamese actually speak Cantonese, they're Chinese Vietnamese. And so there's a great deal of fluidity between the camps and Hong Kong. But Hong Kong becomes frustrated that not enough of the Vietnamese are being resettled, not having fast enough, and they want to deter Vietnamese from leaving Vietnam and coming to Hong Kong. And so to create this deterrence mechanism, they set up a series of closed camps. And this map sort of shows the triangles are the open camps, and the detention centers are the circles. And we can see an increasing number of circles. And from 1982 up until 1996, roughly, Hong Kong goes to this policy of closed camps. And here, Vietnamese will be held in detention camps that look far more like prisons, where they cannot leave, where they are run by the corrections officers in Hong Kong, which are prisons officers, and look like prisons from the point of view of the Vietnamese. And then Hong Kong makes a very important distinction in 1988. And in 1988, the Hong Kong government will decide that the Vietnamese entering are no longer automatically refugees. And they essentially get rid of this 1979 Geneva Conference. And they say not everyone coming is a refugee anymore. Many people are coming who are poor, have economic problems, have family in the United States, but not everyone would be seen as a refugee. And they begin doing individual asylum hearings to determine who would be a refugee and who would not. And the stakes are really high. If you are seen as a refugee and can prove that you meet essentially this definition of someone who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted because of race, religion, nationality, or membership of a particular social group, then you could be resettled. But if you cannot prove this, because the Hong Kong asylum officers do not believe you're being politically persecuted, then you could be repatriated back to Vietnam. At first, the UNHCR is very much opposed to this. They say this could be refoulement, they could be sent back and be persecuted in Vietnam. But within about 6 months to a year, the UNHCR changes its mind, decides actually the war has been over for 15 years. Vietnam is working with the United States. Vietnam wants diplomatic relations. Vietnam is working with the international system. And as a result, the UNHCR says, yes, we're going to have this comprehensive plan of action. And Vietnamese will no longer be given de facto refugee status. Rather, they'll have to prove that they are refugees individually through an interview, case by case. So we can see a dramatic change. Now, for those of us in the United States, this is fairly similar. This is what we sort of have today in the US for large numbers of groups of individuals. But for Vietnamese, this was a change. And Vietnamese begin to protest. They first of all use legal means. So they bring lawsuits against Hong Kong, arguing that the comprehensive plan of action and Hong Kong's screening mechanisms go against due process rights and go against human rights as well. And they bring these cases to the Hong Kong courts, which are effectively British courts within Hong Kong. And these go all the way up to the Hong Kong, the Privy Council in Great Britain. And eventually what is decided is that Hong Kong's needs to make its asylum system better. They need to have better translators. They need to give better due process. But the asylum hearings are allowed to go forward. In some ways, this is seen as a victory for the Vietnamese. They are able to get more due process. On the other, seen as a real step backward. They all have to prove their individual claims. They do not all keep refugee status. And so Vietnamese begin to protest in the camps. Large numbers of people are screened out. Hong Kong screens out the most people. Approximately 90% of the people who try to get asylum in Hong Kong are denied. In the end, Hong Kong will deport over 60,000 Vietnamese back to Vietnam. And so the Vietnamese in the camps begin to protest. They have hunger strikes, they have mass protests, and when their repatriations begin in earnest, there are also conflicts with the Hong Kong security officers. This in many ways goes against what in the United States is often perceived as, quote, a mono-minority discourse, and demonstrates a very aggressive and militant protest within the camp, arguing for refugee identity and the refugee rights to be resettled. The majority of these individuals do not succeed and many are repatriated. And here is an image that a Vietnamese individual did within the camps. You can see the South Vietnamese flag indicating an identity with South Vietnam and anti-communism. And you can also see a sort of very clear sense of rights and a sense that they are being unfairly treated, being held in camps when they should in fact be resettled. Finally, we also get diasporic activists involved as well. Large numbers of Vietnamese American college students come to the aid of Vietnamese in the camps. They send money, volunteers, go as English teachers. They also raise a great deal of money. We also have groups like Boat People SOS that also, like FVPPA, work with Congress members lobbying. And we get groups as well who are active in the camps giving legal assistance. So we have a huge network of activist groups, both within the camps and in the United States, advocating for more resettlement. Again, some of these claims are successful, but others are not. But I think here we can see the parity of this refugee status, that it is politically constructed and that it changes over time, and that Vietnamese are not just waiting for, Americans to save them, but rather are actively engaged politically, creating networks and political movements to be able to resettle, particularly in the late 80s and early 90s. And here are Vietnamese Americans active during the Trump years against deportations against Vietnamese in 2018 and 2019. What does this allow us to think about today? Hopefully this raises questions about when people get refugee status, why, and that it is not simply because it's easy to say who's a refugee and who's not. Today, the United States is giving this temporary protective status. Again, this is not refugee status. There's a new program just announced yesterday allowing individuals to sponsor Ukrainian families. This is a really interesting program because it's sort of putting the burden on individuals, but then also creating more pathways. Of course, there have also been Ukrainians going to the Mexican border. They have been allowed in when, of course, others at the Mexican border have been detained and not allowed into the United States. But what I read in the news, and I don't have anything other than what's in the news, now that will no longer be the case, and that this is meant to discourage Ukrainians from going across the Mexican border to now try to create programs that are a little bit more like the programs, the ODP that Professor Demmer mentioned, but much more on the fly. And of course, there are still Afghanis who are waiting to be resettled on military bases and in camps in the UAE and other parts of the Middle East. And here they are protesting the fact that here it is almost 9 months later, these individuals have not been resettled and rather are still hoping and waiting that they will be resettled in the United States. So here we can see these precarious statuses still at play in our contemporary moment. I've gone on too long. I look forward to your questions and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. August.
Oh, I was clapping for Professor Lippman, not me, but first of all, thank you so much, Nina, for putting this together. Indeed, it's a delight to be on a panel with my two other co-panelists. And of course, this could not be done without you. So thank you very much. My name is Timothy K. August. I'm an associate professor of English at Stony Brook University, which is in Long Island. I work on, of course, refugee literature, specifically Southeast Asian American literature. If I could plug two things, there's my co-edited special issue of the Canadian Review of American Studies titled Vietnam War and the Global Imagination, which I co-edited with Evan Leasbertu and Vinh Nguyen. And then, of course, most recently, I've come out with my book called The Refugee Aesthetic, Reimagining Southeast Asian America, available at Temple University Press, which I'm sure will be popped in the thing. And again, oh, there we go. Thank you so much, Nina. Again, another reason to thank Nina for thanking Dr. Ha for this. And indeed, I'd like to thank, the audience for coming here today. I'm always shocked and delighted that anyone would come and listen to what I have to say. So thank you very much. Now, I fear that my co-panelists, have spoken way too authoritatively on many things. So I'm just gonna have to retreat to beauty and pretty things. So I'm gonna give a talk today called Ocean Vuong, who's a Vietnamese American writer, and a theory of refugee beauty. So perhaps what distinguishes Ocean Vuong's 2019 novel, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, from most other acclaimed refugee works is Vuong's unabashed embrace of beauty. For refugees are not meant to be beautiful. Refugee life certainly is not considered beautiful. Worse, beauty can actively interfere with the smooth functioning of the refugee image. For who helps an abject figure if they're rendered too aesthetically appealing? The history of the refugee image is that refugees are presented as objects to be studied and understood so that hopefully they can receive assistance and move on from this condition. What I plan to ask in this paper then is what can Vuong's beauty add to or upset in this system of refugee representation? Notions of beauty can be suspect to those working in ethnic literary circles, as the standards of beauty are often formed by actors who hold hegemonic positions. Further, beauty can transform horrific events or conditions into pleasing spectacles that draw attention away from the material conditions of those who live in these destitute scenarios. In his review of On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, Asian American Studies critic Min Hyung Song expresses such concern with Elaine Scarry's famous essay on beauty and being just, noting, "I've long thought that the argument values beauty too much and as an obvious good, when it can be a distraction or a palliative, when something uglier or more discordant would be more appropriate." The point is echoed in Rita Felsky's critique of Scarry's essay, where she contends that the examples of beauty that Scarry offers are too rarefied and genteel. Building from the conclusions of philosopher Alexander Nehmas, Felsky argues that the school of aesthetics has directed beauty too far away from everyday life, valuing the reflective qualities of the artwork over the accessible immediate satisfactions of the body and its senses. Vuong's work, while stylistically owing a great debt to the contemplative and complex forms of modern and postmodern aesthetics, we could say addresses some of Felsky's concerns by turning the reader's attention towards the more arresting and sensual, or perhaps base possibilities of beauty, and also finding beauty in the discordant. Hardly rarefied, the most beautiful moments in the text are earthly delights, pleasures of the worlds that are both gorgeous and dirty. Ordinary and fleeting, his refugee writing shows that these images are products of racial and class positions and geopolitical effects. In many ways, Vuong emphasizes how the pursuit of beauty and truth can be a political outcome of artistic engagement, with Little Dog telling his mother, with the protagonist of his book, Little Dog, telling his mother, "That's what writing is after all the noise. Getting down so low, the world offers a merciful new angle, a larger vision made up of small things." This disclosure suggests that the refugee writer can potentially provide a unique perspective where they can find beauty by getting so low that one finds mercy in the new angle offered of the world, if one can muster the attunement, sensuality, and sensitivity to connect the particular to the general. Indeed, Vuong finds beauty in the discordant, using its arresting qualities to hold the reader's gaze at uglier truths. The social landscape of the protagonist Little Dog's refugee life is cataloged through the bruised food found at food banks, the fumes from the nail salon, schoolyard bullying, and the hollowed out core of Hartford's downtown. Yet rather than simply present scenes of poverty and trauma to elicit pity and sympathy, Vuong turns to chronotopic devices like Little Dog's bike to highlight the numerous kinds of distances and inequalities that exist. For instance, at the age of 14, Little Dog secretly takes a job on a tobacco farm outside Hartford, where after riding 8.5 miles each morning, he performs full days of manual labor, being paid under the table. In conventional images of refugee life, refugees are not shown working. They are left waiting, bored at refugee camps or enduring the travails of the journey of refuge. While sometimes these images are portrayed sympathetically, the collective aesthetic force of these scenes suggests that these listless bodies are damaged and will require the receiving nation's resources to rehabilitate them. By contrast, Vuong presents his refugee protagonist working vibrantly. According to Little Dog, and I quote, "The first day I stupidly refused the pair of gloves offered by Manny. By 5 o'clock, my hands were so thick with black, with sap, dirt and pebbles and splinters. They resembled the bottom of a pan of burnt rice. But the work somehow sutured a fracture inside me, a work of unbreakable links and collaboration, each plant cut, picked, lifted, and carried from one container to another, in such timely harmony that no stalk of tobacco, once taken from the soil, never touches ground again. A work of myriad communications, I learned to speak to the men not with my tongue, which was useless there, but with smiles, hand gestures, even silences, hesitations. I made out people, verbs, abstractions, ideas with my fingers, my arms, and by drawing in the dirt. Undeniably romantic and beautiful, the above passage tracks the undocumented men that Little Dog works with and describes the relentless labor they performed. Yet the prose itself is light and vibrant. A vocabulary of work connects him to these undocumented workers whose bodies become linked to his through their similarly thick sap, dirt, pebbles, and splinters as they communicate with their fingers, arms, and drawings. Despite the suturing collaboration and beauty of this work scene, though, Vuong is also careful to note the inequality between these workers and Little Dog, a young refugee teenager. Ron Charles of the Washington Post describes Vuong as, and I quote, emerging from the most marginalized circumstances. But the section of the book that I'm talking about, where I took this quote, concludes with Little Dog saying that he's sorry that these men have to do this work so far away from their families, clinging to dreams of upward economic mobility that will probably never come. Outside of these moments of affectation, the comradeship falls away, as Little Dog's US citizenship makes the 8.5-mile journey seem trivial when compared to the long distances that these men will have to endlessly travel for work. Beauty here provides Vuong the opportunity to connect to the refugee, Little Dog, with the undocumented workers, but also the momentariness of this encounter, the fleetingness, reveals the disparity between the groups when he pulls away. No distances loom longer than those between whiteness and the community in which Little Dog has grown up. Little Dog's boyfriend and object of desire, Trevor, lives in a mobile home with an alcoholic father, and Trevor himself ultimately dies of a heroin overdose, an event which serves as the primary tragedy of the book. Yet even though Little Dog and Trevor are similar in their class horizons, the lived realities of Trevor's whiteness and Little Dog's Vietnamese-ness still separate the two. Again, in an address to his mother, Little Dog takes to his bike to relate. We rode along the Connecticut River as the night broke into itself. I saw all the blocks in our city you were too busy at work to know about, blocks where things happened. Things even Trevor, having lived all his life on the side of the river, the white side, the one I was riding on now, never saw. Soon we were deep in the burbs, in South Glastonbury, and the house lights started appearing, first as orange sparks flitting through the trees, but as we got closer, they grew into wide, fat sheets of gold. You could peer through these windows free of steel bars, their curtains drawn wide open. Through this rich, winding passage, Little Dog's bike ride documents the racial divides of the city. He shows that the gap is both between rich and poor, and his side and the white side, a distance that gradually separates and transforms into a conspicuous exhibit of increasing amounts of wealth. Each loved one, Trevor and his mother, are limited in what they see, whereas the 1.5 generation refugee, Little Dog, is capable of traveling to both sides of the river, seeing the blocks where things happened and going deep into the suburbs, with his dynamic lyricism displaying an acute sensitivity to the rhythms, flows, and inequalities of the city as a whole. The passage swells as the character roots this knowledge about social landscape through lyric images of orange sparks flitting through the trees and the sheets of fat gold. Dangerous, sparkling, and ostentatious, the scene almost stretches to become more than a refugee perspective. It is transformed into an artistic spectacle, but he still holds firm in calling attention to the inherent inequality from which it is born. By filtering social knowledge through beauty, Vuong avoids adding on to the traumatic scenes that are commonly attached to the Vietnam War and refuge. Even Trevor's death is depicted indirectly, an auspicious omission for a book so immersed in his body and sensual presence. Instead, Little Dog engages events like cancer ravaging his grandmother's body, his mother's psychic fissures brought on by refuge, and Trevor's drug overdose, with a mixture of intimacy and distance, connection and alienation, which is how James Dawes describes the narrative style of those who witness and attempt to relate deeply chaotic events. In Little Dog's mediation of these tragedies, Vung leaves the reader with an impression of the complex feelings that the traumatic witnessing produces. Trevor's death is only disclosed through a series of 1 to 5 line fragments that blend observations and recollections about art, sensual moments, Little Dog's childhood, and pharmacology's industries pushing and profit taken of Oxycontin. Through this beautiful literary fragmentation, the reader can infer Little Dog's psychological distress, but does not gain the satisfaction of plot-driven catharsis. That is, the reader is presented with the experience of witnessing all these events together, whereas the details and progressions of these events remain distant and Little Dog's alone. Through beauty, the reader is left to ponder the fate of an embodied refugee individual, replete with sensuality, desires, self-worth, and self-defeat. Summer Kim Lee describes the effect of Vung's representational strategies where, and I quote, "Such interiority gives way to not only austere and cold loneliness, but also to the inexhaustible riches and warm indulgence of taking pleasure in one's own body, self, and company." Instead of a hard, itemized, individual refugee subject developed from the overcoming of unthinkable material and social hardships, Vung develops a collective refugee being that reverberates through relationships with other characters, like his grandmother Rose, his mother, and Trevor, but is not subject to the mass aesthetic presentation so often used to present refugees. Instead, Little Dog plays with the divisions that are assumed to exist between different bodies, at one point addressing his mother, "I am writing you from inside of a body that used to be yours," which is to say, "I am writing as a son." And his erotic encounters with Trevor often blur the limits and functions of body parts. The first time that they had sex, for instance, Little Dog reaches back so that his hand serves as the site of intercourse. As Song notes, the narrator is always careful to note that sex feels good. It also feels a little dirty, where vicissitudes and waves of pleasure and disgust weave characters together in moments of ecstasy and horror that test the limits of themselves and their identities. The intermingling presence can be found in the midst of a few delirious moments in the barn as Trevor and I fucked. When Trevor shouts, "Where am I, Little Dog?" the narrator then replies, "You're Rose, you're Lon, you're Trevor," as if a name can be more than one thing. Deep and wide as a night with a truck idling at its edge, and you can step right out of your cage where I wait for you. Where under the stars we see that at last what we've made of each other, in the light of long dead things, and call it good. This passage exemplifies the relentless pattern of pleasure, disorientation, fear, and sublimity that the characters experience in the book. But the short sentences and sharp comments relent by the end of the passage, as Vung is always careful to resolve these moments through a change in perspective that tries to capture these events as beautiful. On Earth, We're Briefly Gorgeous is filled with explicit sensual encounters involving pleasure, disappointment, humor, and pain. And Vung's focus on pleasure speaks to the political reorientation of refugee being, in which bodies evade narrative reducibility to either injury or resilience through the pleasures felt from within, from staying in one's body that enables one to share it again to and for other bodies. Such sensuality is conventionally absent from refugee narratives, seen as a luxury or at times a traumatic experience itself, lost amongst the ordeals of passage, camps, and relocation. Whereas refugee writers often respond to the needs and wants of others, through the extensive descriptions of sexuality and desire, Vung explores a kind of refugee individualism that is once lonely, sensitive, embodied, and powerful in its beauty. To conclude, I will note that the Vietnamese American figure has been cast as a central character in the drama of US imperialism, where the rescue and the reformation of the fallen is seen as redeeming a lost war. However, in response, in On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, Vung attempts to reset the stylistic ground of refugee presentation, eliding the rigid dichotomy of the refugee as either a silent victim or a political agent, through his expressive renderings of tenderness, masculinity, and sexuality. I offer that Vung foregrounds beauty over identity to present a different type of knowledge about refugee populations, an aesthetic knowledge that is most involved in and stands apart from Vietnamese American life. On Earth, We're Briefly Gorgeous then presents an aesthetic afterlife, to use Christopher Lee's phrase, whereby characters can be read and compared to artistic forms, agents who create ethereal splendors that are fleetingly, or briefly, apparent in their everyday lives. These fleeting moments prompt the reader to approach these presentations of everyday life as an artwork, and refugee stories are not limited to the centering and recounting of traumatic events of war and relocation. Individual moments of lyricism and momentary vision supersede type plotting of the story, as beautiful expression flows from a narrator forged through class relations, geopolitical forces, and racial difference. Indeed, Vuong's refugee protagonist is agonizingly aware of the shadows cast by his position to the US and Vietnam and the ebbs of privilege and degradation that this legacy entails. However, the creation of reverence of beauty itself is prioritized over all other elements in the novel. Undoubtedly, Vuong asks a lot of beauty, positing it as the generative force that demands the conservation and replication of experiences common to Little Dog and other refugees. But beauty becomes his contribution to elongating the refugee condition, resisting the lingering sensual conditions of registering the lingering sexual conditions of refugee life as it transforms across multiple generations and places. And attending to the aesthetic qualities of refugee storytelling repositions these narratives as forms of refugee production, rather than objects that stand in for refugees themselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I truly appreciate the panelists, the speakers, and especially what I really liked was the fact that it all came together. Who knew when I conceived of this way a long time ago. So I really appreciate just the in-depth analysis, the historical analysis, and then the literary analysis, and it just worked out really well. So I appreciate all of you very much. I'm going to ask one question and then I'll open it up to the audience, if that's okay. Sort of host prerogative, I guess. I wanted to know what compelled you to study about Vietnam, Vietnamese American diasporic history, and our literature. Just curious as to what sort of drew you in. Anyone can take it, but I'd like to hear from all three of you.
I can start it off because Amanda's talk actually really resonated with me. So my story's personal. I am from Massachusetts. I had no connection to Vietnam at all and no personal connections. But I studied in Vietnam as an undergraduate in 1994. So right before the embargo was lifted and before there were diplomatic relations. I was one of the very first groups of American college students to be there after 1975. And it was a really formative experience for me. I'd never really been outside of my home region of New England. I'm from Massachusetts and I went to college in Providence, so not far at all. And it really changed the way I thought about American racism, thinking about imperialism, thinking about the histories of US war. And when I was there, there were large numbers of Vietnamese Amerasians still in Saigon or Ho Chi Minh City. And so I did an early research project on Vietnamese Amerasians in the Orderly Departure Program. And so I did that project many years ago, and it always stayed with me in lots of different ways. So that is the personal trajectory. I have some scholarly connections as well. I study US military bases, and I also learned that military bases became used as refugee camps. And so that also sparked a lot of questions for me. Why was the military why was the military in charge of refugees? And making us recognize the relationship between the military and refugee politics. So, but really I can't, for me, it really was being able to travel and study in Vietnam in the 90s when these diplomatic relations were just being finalized that really motivated me. So that tells you my age too. So there you have it.
Amanda or Tim?
Yeah, can you hear me? My story is more scholarly, more professional than personal. So I similarly do not have familial connections to the Vietnamese American community, but I was in graduate school and I actually started out as an early Americanist. My first publication is about the 1790 Jay Treaty. And I was in the seminar where I read a throwaway line in a book, I wish I could remember which one now, that the US and Vietnam hadn't normalized relations until the mid-1990s. And I'm almost embarrassed, but I will admit I didn't know that. I thought it was a typo. And so I, of course, it was not a typo, and I had so many questions, and I wrote a seminar paper for that class on the debates in the US in the 1990s, and just my own perspective and biases I brought to it. I was like, what did the Vietnamese American community say? What did human rights organizations say? And as my professor suggested that I polish up that paper over the summer and submit it for publication. And as I did more work on it over the summer, I just sort of fell down a rabbit hole and realized how little had been written about the post-1975 period, especially from a diplomatic perspective, with comparison to the just avalanche of material on the pre-75 period. And even less had included refugees in the analysis, which just seemed absurd to me given the size of the diaspora. And so, yeah, it was just one of those moments where it was like something was hiding in plain sight that just struck me as fundamentally important and worth doing. And then as I got into the materials and came across people like Kukminda and others, it was just, you know, it was, my grad school advisor said you have to find a project that you don't have a problem setting your alarm at 6 a.m. when no one's going to check on you. And I had no problem setting my alarm at 6 a.m. to research things like this.
Well, my story is I was in graduate school and I read the work of the great Nina Ha, and I decided that, you know, this is the place for me. And it's pretty much. Do I have to answer this question seriously? Is this something I need to do? Okay,
No, it's fine.
Americans are so confessional. I don't know.
That's fine. For people who are still who've still survived and are still on virtually, do you have any questions as well? Or did the speakers have questions for each other? Because I know it's always nice to pick other academics' brains and stuff like that too. So anyone? Questions?
I just wanted to say, like, actually, when, you know, Dr. Littman, you know, when you started your conversation and you said, you know, I must admit, like, this is a paper in progress. This wasn't part of my book, right? And I've been trying to figure out the hook, right? You know, to, you know, what refugee beauty is doing and what, you know, and I'm describing it, but I feel like I couldn't quite find it. But then you said at the very beginning, you're like, I never use the word plight, right? In order to, you know, describe the refugee experience in my book. And I was thinking to myself, like, I mean, I get it, but if we're going to describe a plight, like, refuge is very much a plight, you know, by the dictionary definition. But, you know, I understand that you don't want to do it because it makes, you know, refugees seem abject, right? And there's this overrepresentation in the, you know, again, the aesthetics of the ways refugees are represented as being abject. But I guess your comment really kind of solidified for me, like, maybe what I'm trying to do here is that beauty allows us to look at the plight without it being abject.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I would also say, I mean, part of my, I mean, I'm not a literary scholar, but I think the plight is also such a cliche, and also sort of, it's not that I don't think that refugees have suffered and or have trauma, but I do think that a lot of the phrases and language that's used becomes a trope, which really almost erases the individuality or the specific political stories that create those experiences. And so that those are, you know, it's both not wanting to show abject, it's not wanting to demonstrate or represent refugees as only being helpless or needy, but it's also trying to avoid the language, which I think is in the media just with such repetition, that it sort of creates a flatness that prohibits us from seeing what people's actual traumas or political histories might be.
I'm writing this all down. This is great grist for me. Thank you.
So, But I like your discussion of beauty, because I don't write about that at all. And I think that it's really evocative and worth, it made me rethink a lot of the documents I've looked at or how I framed them. So thank you.
Anyone else? Go ahead. Sorry, Jenna, go ahead.
If a student or a participant or someone else in the audience wants to ask, but I actually had a question for Amanda, which is with the Orderly Departure Program. I just was curious, this is such a historian's question, but what documents you're using? Yeah, I'd just be curious about the type, if you're looking at State Department documents, or if you're looking at what are the archival sources for the Orderly Departure Program? Because I did research on that such a long time ago. And for those of you who might have come in late, most of the time in American discourse, when we talk about Vietnamese refugees, there's an automatic association with boat people. But as Professor Demers demonstrated, a substantial percentage of Vietnamese in the United States did not come via boats, but came through this state-to-state, it was actually run by the UNHCR, but essentially a program to try to prevent boat people so that people could apply for refugee in Vietnam. And then they're actually all sent to the Philippines for 6 months, or most people are sent to the Philippines for 6 months, and then they go to the US. But I just was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the archives you've used.
Yeah, yeah, I'm muted. Okay. As you of course know, Jana, the actual agreement that creates the Orderly Departure Program is an incredibly brief 7-point memorandum of understanding between the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and Vietnam. It is like the shortest thing you could imagine. And so the research I did was a lot of State Department documents. A lot of it was from the families of Vietnamese political prisoners. Their files is over like 350 linear feet of stuff. So they just had great record keeping, and so much of it was there. The UNHCR has significantly increased their digitized documents. Even from when I started the project, I'm working on a new article on the Geneva Convention in 1979, and I found so much more now than maybe certainly I hope I'm a better researcher now, but even from when I started my dissertation, it was remarkable to me how much more was online. So a lot of the Orderly Departure Program, I guess I didn't find like a central, like, here's all the ODP stuff. It was mostly backdooring it from a lot of different places.
Thanks.
Carolyn, yeah,
sure. I put a kind of confusing message in the chat, and I'm sorry if somebody opens my door and I'll have to sign off. But I'm an ecologist, and I unfortunately missed the beginning, so we may have already talked about this. I apologize if so. But as an ecologist and as the child of a first-generation immigrant who fled China, I'm curious about the physical connection with place and displacement, and how, as Americans, I mean, of course, the Vietnamese refugee experience is very visibly traumatic, right? But so many of us, even whose ancestors immigrated on purpose, it was still a traumatic displacement, right? And so I'm curious about, whether any of your work reflects opportunities to try to develop a sense of place in a new place, and whether communities that connect through gardens or natural areas, if you have any sense of whether trying to connect with a sense of place can reduce or maybe it exacerbates trauma by highlighting the loss.
In some cases, sorry, I was just going to say, this is kind of a tangential, but I think worthwhile remark on your question is, no, my research doesn't do that exactly. I would love to read that book. But one thing that I think is worth mentioning is that, to my knowledge at least, the Vietnamese American community was the only group that the US government intentionally tried to disperse to prevent the creation of so-called little Saigons for fear of violence against them in the wake of the Vietnam War and the American tendency to see Vietnamese as enemies rather than allies, etc. And that of course was a failure. That the communities were dispersed, but that of course we have gatherings of Hmong in Minnesota and of Vietnamese in Southern California and the Gulf Coast and DC and others. And so it's interesting to contemplate the perhaps extra difficulty in that regard of that policy had for communities and the ways they had to sort of overcome that policy once they resettled. But that is not my expertise.
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts. One, to piggyback on Amanda's point, I actually am writing an essay comparing Vietnamese and Cubans. I also think one of the reasons the Vietnamese aren't resettled collectively is because the government didn't want another little Havana. They're fairly conscious of that community in Miami. But I would say in my work, I look at refugee camps, and I'd say a few things. One is a lot of the oral histories of the camps in the 70s, not so much in the 80s as they became more repressive, but there's a range of people's memories about them. So there's a displacement, but particularly for younger people, it was a time of freedom. They didn't have to go to school. They could go to the beach all day. People fell in love, had a boyfriend, had a girlfriend. And so it's actually really interesting to read those oral histories because depending on the age of the person, it could be very traumatic, but it could also be a moment where they spend a lot of time sort of on the beach and have some ways almost nostalgic memories. And this is from oral histories, not that I've conducted, but UC Irvine has a very good collection of oral histories. There are other collections as well. And that was actually surprising for me in some ways, going to Timothy's point. Like I was expecting just stories of only trauma. And in fact, the oral histories have a real range of sentiments. The others, I would recommend a colleague, Quan Tran's work. She's a professor at Yale. She has a really good essay about memory and sort of representation and loss in the refugee camps in Malaysia. But in the camps themselves, because people are there for long periods of time and people die in the camps, there are memorials in the camps, there are cemeteries within the camps. So I've visited a lot of these former refugee camps in Southeast Asia, and they often have memorials, and Vietnamese Americans often create pilgrimages where they go to remember those who were lost, either at sea or in the camps themselves. And if you're thinking about place, it's different from the question you're asking about placemaking here in the US, but it's very interesting the ways that people go back, they paint memorials. And the one that was most, I remember the most in Malaysia, someone had left a solar powered music device of some sort. It was like a radio, and had it playing Vietnamese songs through solar power. So no one was there. And I went with a guide to see the former camp, and there was music playing because someone had left it for a family member they had lost, I imagine. And it was there through solar power. And that really was emotional.
Thank you. Yeah.
Did anyone have other questions, comments?
I mean, I didn't know how we're doing for time, but I can also respond to the last question.
Sure.
Just,
Yeah.
You know, one of the chapters in my book is about, you know, refugee space, but more the imagination of refugee space. One writer, a Vietnamese American writer, Amy Phan, has a book called The Re-Education of Cherry Trong. And it begins with a character who is creating a development in Vietnam that is built in the style of Orange County, right? So he's building it in order to court Vietnamese Americans or people in the Vietnamese diaspora who want to return to Vietnam, what she says is your true home, but with all the comforts of America, right? And I just found it this really provocative, structuring of, how this character who was he screwed up a lot in the US, was able to kind of remake himself by going to Vietnam. Is there, right? Now, of course, this, throughout the book, she doesn't explore it too much, but I mean, it raises questions about, overseas Vietnamese influence on Vietnam, right? The refashioning of space, finding new frontiers, right? And indeed, as the work of Evan Leaspertu and Nu Le speak about is, Vietnamese refugees themselves being settler colonial people, and how to reconcile, or how to negotiate, these two factors, right? So I just found it this interesting place to think about refugees as placemakers, right? And as both of the other talks mentioned, about as agents, but then also, the consequences potentially of being placemakers and exceeding these particular confines that have been put on them.
Thank you. We have a few more minutes left. I can give you back some time as well. I did have a question for you all, because we've been talking about refugees. What are your sort of constructs of refugee now versus when you first started in academia? Like, what do you think of this term today versus how you probably entered into that space previously? Has it changed, or has it sort of remained constant? Is that too large a question?
I mean, one of the central premises of my book is that, there's a bunch of Southeast Asian American writers who are now embracing the refugee position as transformative, right? Like, it's become a place where writers can think about, people can think about, the impacts of geopolitical forces, and, can write some forms of redress, and perhaps as an imaginative opportunity, right, to rethink their place in the world, because, conventionally refugees are considered to be, downtrodden, et cetera, a drain on resources. And so people want to move on from the refugee position as quickly as possible, understandably, right? But there's a group of writers that are sitting down and saying, no, wait, let's elongate the refugee condition. Let's think about refugees as war narratives, as, narratives of, that speak to, the ways that the world works, instead of moving past it. Or else we just keep on creating new groups of refugees that have no historical memory, right? We should think about refugees as a constant now, right? We have a refugee Olympic team, right? That competes, right? They're supposed to be created through moments of exception, right? But it seems to be a constant condition now, right? So how do we deal with that as a globe?
That's really interesting. I mean, in my work, and it's been critiqued, but I still think it was the right choice for me. I actually don't describe the Vietnamese as refugees in the book. And I don't use the word refugee when it's my voice talking about the Vietnamese. And it's not because I don't think that they were refugees, nor do I try to sort of evade the trauma, but it's that much of the book is about the changing legal categories and about how fraught that category is and how it changed over time. And I also didn't want to be in the position where I was discussing everyone as a refugee, because that would make the writing unclear, because I'm writing about this change of the category. And then I also didn't want to be the asylum officer saying, I think that these are the real refugees and these are not the real refugees. That was also seemed to be a very dangerous and, it was not a position that I wanted to be in as the writer. I think I was able to balance that. So I actually choose to not use the word refugee, although it's a book about refugees, and which is a complicated balancing act. And so even in the title, it's called In Camps, and it's like refugees, comma, asylum seekers, repatriates, because the publisher needed to have refugees in the title. And I kept saying, but I don't use the word refugee to describe the Vietnamese. And so we had to find a way to do both in that project. And I would say that for me, it's been recognizing, and it seems like an obvious point, but just how politically constructed the category is, how much power is in that category, that at times it comes with greater benefits and at times it comes with greater suspicion, but that it is, I know, it is not a fixed category. It's not something that is easily defined, and that we also need to be really conscious of all the other categories that are created around it, which I think are also generally attempts, not always, but generally attempts to in fact avoid giving the benefits and rights that the UNHCR definition often provides. So those are just some of my thoughts.
Yeah, I sort of fall similarly to Janet, given I'm also writing about the legal debates about who gets refugee status and who doesn't, and who gets to decide. And so because of that work, and also on my rereading of Janet's book, I have to say, I have been thinking a lot about legal refugee status as narrative, as a conversation, and the sort of hoops of what is being told, and then who the audience is, who's doing the listening and who's doing the deciding, and the negotiation of, even when we're limiting to just the legal refugee status. I guess one of the things that is most stunning to me, or something that I think about all the time, is the ease with which we use the word colloquially, like we talk about refugees from natural disasters, in a way that sort of press and the pundits, like everybody seems to agree upon, but that are totally divergent from the legal definition. And so a lot of scholars, like Rosa Brooks, has written about the ways that war has escaped out of its legal definition and has become something wrangly and unmanageable in the 21st century. And I've been thinking a lot about refugees in that same way of, there's like the legal narrow definition, which is still a site of very important and meaningful contestation, but also this much larger milieu in which we're having these discussions. And I haven't quite sort of gotten to a nice sentence here to leave you with, but I think that those two things, that it's not a coincidence that they're happening at the same time. And I'm really interested in and enjoy reading works which sort of help untangle that duplexity of the incredibly remaining importance of the legal definition and the extent to which the lived realities have far outpaced what the legal definition is. So yeah, as always, far more complex now than when I thought I knew when I started, I'm sure. I mercifully can't quite recall what I thought when I started.
Do we have time for me to ask a quick question? No? Okay.
Well, can you ask it after, and then we'll.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Now I get to close. Thank you everyone for attending this amazing event. The ACE will be hosting one last APIDAHM event, which is on April 28th in hybrid format. So for those of you on the lookout, please go to the ACE's webpage to see. It will also be about the refugees from a local and global perspective. So I'm really excited about that. And those of you who want to attend, probably not you, Jana, it's going to be at 6 at night. And just FYI for the rest of you, Ramen for Reading Day is May 5th. So we're hosting ramen with all the toppings at the center from 11 to 2. And then we'll have the achievement ceremony. The APID achievement ceremony will be on May 11th. Once again, thank you everybody for your support of the ACE for the past year, academic year. And thank you so much to the speakers. You are wonderful. And I've been fortunate enough to know you for quite a while now. Jana and Tim for a really long time over conferencing years. So thank you, and special shout out to the audience, and particularly to our ACE faculty fellow, Dr. Carol Carla Haas, who asked the question about ecology. Sorry, really, really appreciate all of you. So thank you, everyone. And I am going to stop recording, and then Tim, you can ask your question.